Hello, everyone. I can see that there are more people who are joining the Zoom room, so I'm happy to now begin the dialogue session proper. So hello again, and on behalf of White Plus, I would like to welcome you to this dialogue session, Resourcing Migrant Women's Activism in Europe. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are. And for those of you who are new to White Plus, White Plus, or Women in Development Europe Plus, is a European network of associations and activists that fights for women's rights as part of a larger struggle for social justice, sustainable livelihoods, and human rights. We advocate for changing European policies that affect people in and outside of Europe, as we understand Europe to be larger than the EU. My name is Noor Hidayah Hassan, and I am part of the White Plus Secretariat supporting the network's Migration and Gender Working Group. Today's online dialogue is organized through the Migration and Gender Working Group, and we are pleased to have you with us today. The objective of this working group is to enhance collaboration, build stronger networks, and create new knowledges for migrant women groups and those supporting them in Europe and beyond. Our working group is a diverse working group that is made up of associations from many countries across Europe, like in Spain, Serbia, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, and many more. And they are either groups led by migrant and refugee women or organizations that work closely with migrant and refugee women. Before I start introducing the topic and the moderator, I would like to briefly mention some practicalities. Now, for this webinar, we have 2.5 hours with a 10-minute break in between. There will be 3 rounds of questions from the moderator for the speakers. And after the second round, we will have a 10-minute break. After all three rounds of questions, we aim to allow for time to answer any questions from the audience. Now, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, you can use the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom panel. You can also use that if you would like to share your work that is relevant to this dialogue. If time permits, we can also facilitate live contributions from the audience. If you want to take the floor and ask your question through audio or through video, kindly indicate this in your question or comment in the chat. Now, we are committed to a civilized feminist exchange and interaction. As the organizers, we reserve our right to exclude anyone who uses offensive or discriminatory language or who abuses this space in an undemocratic and/or anti-feminist way. Now, while this online dialogue is mostly in English, there is also simultaneous interpretation in Spanish. Depending on your language preference, you can click on the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom panel and choose your preferred language. So for today, we also anticipate a very rich discussion for this dialogue. We have an artist, Marga RH, who is a Latin American feminist activist and illustrator based in the UK. So she will be doing live graphic recording of this event, capturing the key takeaways from the speaker's interventions in illustration form. So if you would like to see her doing the illustration live, you can also head over to the Vimeo link that we will share in the chat box shortly. Now, recently, White Plus conducted a review of EU funds channeled towards migrant women-led projects. And this paper concludes that groups working at intersecting forms of marginalization, like migrant women, are not considered as relevant stakeholders for EU's programs. Now, at the same time, the EU has not produced disaggregated data by sex, age, ethnicity, and migration status to allow for a thorough assessment of large parts of its budget. Now, this paper also finds that while there is available EU-level funding to advance gender equality, this money simply does not reach civil society, women's groups, and migrant women organizations. I'm happy to announce that this paper is now available on White Plus website, and we will be sharing that link in the chat box shortly. So today's dialogue session is held in context of this paper's conclusion that there is a lack of financial flows reaching migrant women's organizations. Today's discussion is also a rather unique one, as it is an exchange between representatives of foundations and migrant women leaders to explore what kind of hurdles and solutions exist for migrant women groups in Europe when it comes to fundraising. Now, given the bureaucratic nature of the EU, with its very complex funding application requirements, private foundations could be a model for public bodies on how to support migrant women-led organizations and grassroots groups. Now, despite facing immense challenges and lack of resources, especially during this last few years during the pandemic, migrant women-led organizations have often demonstrated very strong leadership, especially in building solidarity networks and safe spaces for their communities, and therefore they should be better supported. Now, hopefully this dialogue will spur more conversations and actions around resourcing migrant women's activism in Europe. So before I pass the floor to the moderator, who will then introduce our wonderful speakers and then begin the dialogue, it is my pleasure to first introduce her to you. So Paula Riederman is a program manager at Kalala Women's Fund in Barcelona, where she is mainly responsible for running projects in the areas of migrant women and human rights defenders. Paula is a Chilean lawyer and holds a master's degree in intercultural education. Before joining Kalala, she lived in Berlin for 8 years, where she acted as program coordinator of a women's project fighting against trafficking in women. Thank you for being today's moderator, Paula, and the floor is now yours. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Hidaya. Hi to everyone. So I am very pleased to be here today. I would like to thank White Plus for inviting me to be a part of this dialogue. And yeah, thank you all for being here today, especially to the speakers, to the audience, and to the translators. So as Hiraya already mentioned, our expectation is that today we will have a dialogue. So we want you to feel free to ask questions. Please use the chat for it, because as Hiraya mentioned, the dialogue will last for 2.5 hours. So probably during you are hearing the speakers, you will have ideas, you will connect with things. So we would like to hear what you are thinking when you are listening to them, and at the end we will time to ask the question.
Para que luego podáis plantear estas preguntas a las ponentes.
To our speakers. Firstly, I would like to introduce you to Jennifer Kamau. She's the co-founder of International Women's Space, which is an anti-racist feminist group consisting of refugee and migrant women, as well as women that don't have this experience. The group was formed during the occupation of Oranienplatz, which is a square in Berlin district of Kreuzberg, and the Gerhard Hauptmann Schule school in Berlin-Kreuzberg. International Women's Space fosters solidarity and cooperation among migrant women, publishes books, and organizes campaigns, protests, and conferences on the topics of seeking asylum and migrant women's struggles. Among others, in 2017, they organized a 2-day conference in Berlin called Als ich nach Deutschland kam, which is when I came to Germany, and they have been supporting women in asylum centers during the COVID pandemic. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for being here today.
Thank you.
Secondly, we have Sophie Godiep, who has worked over the past 10 years on social change in the migration field. Sophie currently leads the inclusion work with EPIM, which is the European Program for Integration and Migration, which is the largest European philanthropic collaborative on migration. Sophie is personally committed to building more equity in the sector, increasing the representation of people with lived experience, and enhancing trust-based philanthropy. Thank you, Sophie, for being here. Then I would like to introduce you to Vanina Serra. She's a senior intersex people who are advancing their rights to self-determination, self-representation, and artistic expression. Currently, Vanina leads Mama Cash's work on the effects of the closing space phenomenon on feminist organizing. And before joining Mama Cash, Vanina worked as a program officer with the Women's Initiative for Gender Justice and with different organizations in Southeast Asia. Thank you, Vanina. And then I also would like to introduce you to Marcela de la Peña. She is a consultant in different capacities as research, training, management, etc., on gender issues, especially working with migrant women. Marcela is originally from Peru. She is the coordinator of the World Women's March in Belgium, which is composed by 20 feminist organizations and 2 trade unions there in Belgium. And she also is the coordinator of CHASCA, which is an association of migrant women, which is working especially with Latin American and French-speaking African women. Thank you, Marcela, for being here today. So I want to thank you all. I am very honored to be sharing this space with you. I have followed the work you have been doing on your different organizations and groups for some time now. So I'm really happy to be here today. And I'm looking forward to what I am sure will be a very interesting exchange of insights and experiences. So I will start now with the first question. As Hiraya already explained, we will have 3 rounds of questions. We will have a 10 minutes break. And I will start now asking you, Marcela, if that is okay. So the first question would be, what are the challenges your organization faces when it comes to fundraising?
Gracias, Paula. Gracias a todo el mundo.
Thank you, everyone, for the invitation, for being here with you today. I am also representing civil society in Belgium in following the equality plan for the rights of women, where also migration is also very present, is also very important. So what are the main challenges these years in which I've been living here as a migrant woman, and like the other women who I work with, is that in order to have access to funds, they ask a great deal of professionalization. You have to have access to different types of forms, of requirements that every single sector asks you for, be it the public sector, the NGOs, or the European Union. And this is one of the main problems, because most of the migrant women's associations are small, are not official, and we don't have the time or to respond to this type of requirements. Sometimes there's money, there's calls for example, in the public sector in Belgium, who's quite sensible to women's rights issues, but we don't have a capacity to respond. So, for example, I remember once I was lobbying quite a lot, 5-6 years ago, I was lobbying to get some kind of budget for association of migrant women and also other migrants for cooperation. So projects that we're doing from here to origin countries. But after a lot of effort also with other NGOs, with other organizations, not only women and migrant organizations, we managed to get this budget, but we were never able to access to it in the end. We did formations, we were a big collective of women, and till this day, we haven't been able to spend this money because they ask us too much time, too much professionalism, too much free work to migrant women and to many women who are working in the domestic work sector, for example, or that is care, and they don't have time. I don't have time either, but I'm not in that sector. But that's a problem. So they finance activities in origin countries, also here, but what they don't fund is the post, the work of this person. So you have to get a lot of free work in order to get access to these funds. I don't know if I'm speaking too much, but another of the main aspects, an important factor, is that if there are bigger organizations that also work with migrants, usually, I don't want to judge them, but they usually have better results because they have the capacity, they have the professionalism that migrant women don't have. So we can't access to these funds. So this is one of the main problems, this complexity, this professionalism that is required, this free work, this free time that is required to invest in order to get some funds, and also a question of priorities, because sometimes the budget that exists, be it from international NGOs or corporation or whatever, or different governments here, they are not necessarily the ones that the women want. So one has to juggle to try and integrate what they want to kind of adapt to these budgets. So they're not adapted to the main interests and needs of migrant women, basically. This is also one of the important factors that we face. And it's a hurdle, it's a challenge we have in order to have access to the funds. I don't know if it's okay. Yeah.
With Sophie. Sophie, if you can share, what is the funding landscape like for migrant-related projects in Europe, according to your experience? Sophie, I don't hear you. Am I the only one?
Yes, we don't hear Sophie.
Is it better now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank
Perfect.
you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
yes, I can't hear you actually now.
Shall I repeat the question? You got the question.
No, I heard the question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So your question was about the funding landscape. So when I think about a funding landscape, I think about 3 dimensions. So I think about the side of the recipients, so the ecosystem of migrant-related project implementers, I would say. I think about those providing the funding, so the actors shaping and awarding the funding. So in my case, I will be speaking about the philanthropic sector, which I know better than the public sector. And I also think about the type of funding, so project versus core funding. So if I look at the recipients of the funding, I would have 2 observations on that side. So I would say that currently the funding to support migrant-led projects are still very much at the margin rather than at the center for most donors, and that's also the case in our own case, so as EPIM. So I would say that the migration sector is one of the few sectors which is not being led by people with lived experience of the issues who are who are the most harmed by the policies that we are addressing. The situation, I believe, is rooted in a historical context where migration and asylum systems haven't been designed by migrants and refugees themselves, which continues to lead to certain power dynamics. So a lot of the projects that we see are that are currently in place are, for instance, very much service delivery focused, with people concerned as beneficiaries rather than agents of their own trajectory. Besides service delivery type of work, in our case, we support a lot of advocacy work, but there as well, we see that the policy spaces are generally closed to people who have lived migration experience. They are much more difficult to access, at least. And this is also due to the fact that the right to political participation, such as the right to vote, for instance, or stand up for elections, are not generally also not granted to people who are refugees and migrants. Another observation is that funding continues to go mainly to those I would qualify as migration-focused type of organizations, rather than, for instance, human rights organizations or organizations which are more generally focusing on social issues. So based on my 5 years of experience in the philanthropic sector, I really see some kind of segmentation between migrant-related issues on the one hand and everyone else's issues on the other hand. So a concrete example for me would be the inclusion field, on which migration-focused organizations have specialized, and where there is a very limited presence, for instance, from anti-racism and feminist organizations, but also more mainstream organizations, for instance, working on housing. I have also observed that certain terms used in the migration sector are also still very much racialized, I would say, and used for migrants specifically, which reinforces somehow the segmentation of the sector. So one example, for instance, is we're working a lot as EPIM on issues related to pushbacks, and pushbacks are very much associated to migrants, but ultimately those are issues that are about violence, torture, in some cases even forced disappearance. So the fact that there are certain words being used for certain groups makes that there is a kind of segmentation as well that is at play in the sector. When it comes to actors shaping and awarding the funding, I would say that there are similar trends of segmentation between migrant-related topics and other social issues, which also contributes, of course, to shape the civil society sector and the way organizations are able to operate and accommodate for the type of funding that's out there. I would also say that people with lived experience are still relatively absent from the philanthropic landscape as members of staff, but also as decision makers for the funding that's being granted as part of the governance. There are more and more efforts, I would say, to diversify staff based on that realization by actively recruiting people with lived experience or people who are part of the communities which are the most harmed in certain organizations, board, leadership, team, staff, etc. But this is still, I would say, the exception rather than the norm. And then I will close with the type of funding. So the funding is still very much, I would say, project-based rather than core funding. The funding is rather short-term rather than long-term. I would say that migrants and people who migrate are very often still considered as beneficiaries rather than agents in many of the projects. The funding is, I would say, also very much crisis-driven. We've seen it now with Ukraine, with the risk of funding being shifted from certain causes and organizations. So it seems that we are moving from crisis to crisis rather than having enough breathing space to actually think about how we can address the issues most systemically. And which also means that oftentimes we are, through funding, putting band-aids on the existing system rather than having a clear vision or having even spaces to define that vision for systemic change and what that could be. And I will stop here for now, Paula.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Now I would like to ask a question to Jennifer. Jennifer, I will ask you the same question I started with Marcela, which is, What are the challenges your organization faces when it comes to fundraising?
Thank you very much for this question. I will add to what everybody else is saying because it feels like the same challenge. But to begin with, I want to mention that it is very hard for non-registered organizations, and in this I mean grassroots groups, especially in Germany. I'm talking about Germany because this is where I am based, to get funding. So when we started, we had were it not for Mama Cash that trusted and funded us without being registered, we would not have been able to exist. Because then, like me, I was an illegal person, and the other migrants that I was with were still new, and we were trying to figure out what the situation is here in Germany. And the other challenge is that funding is also very limited because as migration and racism, the topic of migration and racism go together. And most of the funding that is coming from Global South is and the migration is coming from people from the global, funding is coming from the Global North, and the people asking for funding is coming from the Global South. And it creates a very huge, a situation that is very unbalanced, because then we have to prove that as migrants, we know and can create and implement our projects. That's one thing. And this proving is usually, of course, then you find the hours that you put, you have to work more hours to prove, because of course there is the challenge of the language. There is the challenge of the structures of how you have learned how to do things, and now the new country that you're trying to adapt to. And some of these challenges are some things that also are not acknowledged. And then co-funding is very little of. In short, it's hard to find organizations that can give co-funding. And when this co-funding is given, it's over a period of 2 years, probably it should be longer, because then we are able to work within a certain framework without too much pressure. Because one, there is the issue of the paperwork when you're applying for these applications, and it's a lot of work. Also, the fact that we are working with projects to fill in the gaps of the monies that we do not have. Then we find most of our time we are making applications for new projects vis-a-vis doing the political work that we would like to engage in. This is such a compromising situation that we need to really address, that our purpose is not only to do projects. As political groups, we need to be recognized as people who want to administer change in the countries that we are living. The other thing is that because of these little funds, we have to be dependent on volunteers. And in most cases, these volunteers are white people, and they come to the organizations, either they change the dynamic of the organization, or they want to make influences in the activism that we are doing, or you cannot rely on them to finish the work they have said they have finished, because for them, time for them is crucial. And this privilege of having enough time is something we do not have, especially if you're working in this kind of organizations, which we have to constantly and constantly keep proving that we are sufficient enough. The other challenge is that there are very strict rules. For example, International Women's Space is a refugee and migrant women organization. So when we have funding that stretches to projects that are being done by refugee women, the fact that they have no permission to work then makes it very limited for them to be included in these monies that come for their projects, unless you think on in a very political and very feminist way to make sure that these monies are equally distributed to everyone, then again they are left behind with this inclusion of political work and representing themselves. And of course, it's important for a group like ours. We don't work with state funding. So it's by decision. We don't take state funding because, of course, when you take state funding, it kind of wants to influence the kind of work we do. So somehow we cause limitations and we suffer from these decisions that we make, and we have to stay by them. Otherwise, we will not have the freedom to do the political work that we are engaging in on a daily basis. And these are some of the biggest challenges that we are facing. And I will just give an example. While we have to work like for 40 hours a week for very little salary, and the Europeans work for 10 hours a week for double the salary that we are working with. So this is also another form of, if you have to remain in political work, then it means you have to acknowledge this form of exploitation that we are constantly facing. And funding is very challenging in terms of the fact that we are living in a very capitalistic society. We need to pay, we need this funding to be able to even exist in this space. So again, I will make a call out for more core funding over a longer spread period of time, so that we can ensure that our work is sustainable. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So now I would like to ask Vanina. Vanina, if you can share your impressions about what is the role of women's funds in sustaining migrant women activism?
Thanks, Paula, and also thanks to Jennifer, Sophie, and Marcela for sharing their input already. So what is the role of women's funds? Let me start by saying that women's funds are diverse. So we are an ecosystem in ourselves, and what I'm going to say is a bit of a generalization because we cannot go into details. But I would say that the role of women's funds is threefold. First of all, women's funds are usually much more connected to women's rights movements and feminist activism than other funders. So there's an important element of political understanding and political solidarity. And that cannot be underestimated because it creates trust with activists. At least that's what we try to do, creating trust with activists and mutual exchange of knowledge, networking, and spaces as well. So I would say the political solidarity that comes from women's funds being part of the movements that we are serving is an important element in our role in support of migrant women's groups. Secondly, it's a very practical one. Usually women's funds are more accessible to smaller groups. We try to keep our paperwork not so burdensome. We try to make it accessible, having it in different languages. We try to be able also to fund groups that are not registered, which is quite important because of also what you were saying, Jennifer. So not all groups can be registered, specifically when they are starting. So that's a very important phase. And also we try to provide groups with core funding, recognizing the importance of political work as work that needs to be paid. So activists need to receive a salary for the work that they're doing. Flexible funding because things change and social change takes time as well, of course. And then also multi-year as much as possible because social change also needs peace of mind, right? Like activists need to be able to invest their time and full attention rather than having to fill in our forms. And then thirdly, I think an important role that we can play is being a bridge between feminist activists and spaces that may not be so accessible to migrant women's groups. at the EU level or bilateral donors, for instance, are really trying to bring the voices of women's rights, migrant women's rights activists into those spaces and provide them with the space there to be able to influence decisions and also access more and additional funding. So I would say these are the three roles that I see women's funds playing.
Thank you very much, Vanina. So now I would like to go back to Jennifer. Jennifer, if you could share with us, what are some effective strategies that your organization has used in fundraising?
They may not be effective, but it kind of also keeps us in a survival mode, because then we have to have as many projects running as possible. And with these projects, when they start running, then some of the project money has to be diverted to something else. And I will give a practical example, for example. The most important thing is that we require a space to be. And I have seen the difference we have had since being placed in a certain place, having an office, that's what I mean, vis-a-vis not having a space, so women can directly come to us. And when we do not access funding, especially for paying office space, then we have to think around having so many projects so that a certain percentage that is required to remain within the organization remains. And this is what we are trying to use to fund our office, you know? And we have not come up with strategies. The only things that we probably have come up with is how to ensure that the funding we get is shared with everybody who is working. We are saying, and we are saying always very loudly, that political work is work, activism is work, and people need to be paid for the work that they do. So we are really trying to ensure anybody who is engaged politically also is paid, regardless whether they have permission to work or they don't have permission to work. So we still have not come up with proper strategies of this situation. Again, we are still not a very old organization, and it's only in 2017 that we even started having an office, which is so important. So I'm waiting to learn from the rest, the strategies that they have come up with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that honest answer. So my next question would be for Sophie. Sophie, what role do you see EPIM and other grant makers playing in realizing social justice and human rights for migrants?
Thank you, Paula. So the roles I will describe are in some cases wishes and some other cases ambitions, but I just want to say as a disclaimer that we are in no way there yet. So I will mention 4 of them. The first role I would see would be to show courage by, in our own case, leading the way. Why? Because as when you introduced me and EPIM, you shared that we were a collaborative, which means that we bring together a number of funders that come from very different places. So I do really see a role for us in particular to lead the way through a clear vision that really centers our work on people and migrants themselves as agents and not as beneficiaries. That would be a first point. By showing courage, I would also refer to the notion of risk. I think risk can be understood in different ways. And my experience in the philanthropic sector is that very often risk is being associated to funding, being directed to small, young, and grassroots organizations, informal organizations that are not registered. But my wish would be that the notion of risk is being shifted to the fact that by not investing in certain movements led by people concerned, that this is actually being seen as a risk rather than the type of risk that I described before, which is still very much the norm. The second role I would see is one around representation and about ensuring representation by getting more and more people concerned into the philanthropic sector. I think there is a real difference in being able to say we rather than they. And I really like the type of wording that a colleague of mine has used recently, which is that the story gets really different when you have skin in the game. And I think that it should very much be about that, and that we should have more people with skin in the game shaping the type of funding that we provide. But there is definitely still a lot of awareness raising to do about why that is necessary. The third role would be to be curious and humble and to make the extra effort by reaching out to those who are the most harmed by the issues we address and are acting and resisting. In some cases, that means trying to see who those actors are out there, because it's always more comfortable to work with the same ones. So very big organizations, well established and so on. And it does require more work to work with smaller organizations and to even know that they exist. And I do think that there is a real role and almost duty of the sector to make that extra effort. We can also do so by immersing ourselves and getting to know how people are self-organizing and building ecosystems of change. That's also something we are exploring internally, to be closer to the field rather than just sitting in our offices. I know that some funders out there are already doing that very well. And I think there is also a duty from our end to understand how different forms of inequalities are being interwoven. I think Hidayah in her introduction already introduced the notion of intersectionality, and how when you're at this section of different types of oppression, it's just much more difficult to fit into the perfect box for you to have access to funding. So I think there is also some awareness raising to do and some self-learning that needs to be done as well. And finally, as a last point, I would say that we have a role and duty when it comes to holding ourselves accountable as funders. And especially, I'm here referring to accountability vis-a-vis the people we are ultimately trying to support and whose lives we intend to improve through our work. And by that, I mean really understanding how our funding processes work and how they may reinforce certain power dynamics that you've also described, Jennifer, by making it more, in some cases, our processes make it much more difficult for certain organizations to apply. And in many cases, I think it's one thing to understand, but it's something else to do something about it. And as EPIM, we are progressively understanding, but we are putting certain steps in place, but we would like definitely to do more in that respect. And I would say that holding ourselves accountable also means adopting an equity lens when looking at issues, by paying attention to the factors such as gender, race, ethnicity, when analyzing problems and designing strategies. And there I also feel like there is still a long way to go. So for all of these points, I would say that it's really important for us to look at ourselves as funders and to identify the structures of power and how in many ways they contribute, not necessarily always to address the issues, but really to perpetuate certain types of marginalization.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So my next question would go to Marcela. Marcela, if you can share, what are it's the same question I already asked Jennifer. What are some effective strategies that your organization has used in fundraising?
Sí, una de las principales estrategias es, por ejemplo,
even if it seems superficial, it is not. It's getting together when there's an opportunity of funding. We get together, different groups. And what's important is this exchange of abilities. For example, if I know how to write project, this is a technical capacity I have that I put for the collective. There's others that have other capacities. So the idea is to exchange, associate, to respond to different funding opportunities. And that isn't as easy as one would like, because we have to share the same interests, the same ideas. So there are grassroots organizations, for example, that are very, very, very grassroots, that are doing activities that have to do with integration. For example, here there are two positions, integration, social integration activities or development activities. So you have to decide and have the same perspective in order to not need the support of other organizations. So this is one of our main strategies, which we build slowly. But when there are opportunities, we get together, especially with the organizations that we know. Another one, as a migrant women, is alliances with other groups of women or networks. For example, what we do with the Women's March is at a political level. We want to integrate the call of more funding for women, more funding for migrant women. So for us, it is very important to have a vindication that forms part of all the other feminist groups in which we take part, so that we visualize our demands. So when you are more visible and you have more support, you can be a better candidate. So you get to be seen as a group that has its funding needs. So this is a way in which you raise awareness in a different women's association in Belgium and migrant organizations. Migrant associations need to be visibilized, or for example, undocumented women need to be visibilized. So in these big alliances in Belgium, we are in a debate because the government here is very close to the idea of regularization. So there's a lot of movement in this sense. And as migrant women, we have to be there because this strengthens our presence with other migrant collectives. Because we also have problems with other migrant collectives. So to be there, to be in this type of movement is important. Not to be something apart and marginalized, but form part of a movement for the rights of migrant people in general. Another idea is to, in Belgium, this government is a government that has a deep agreement of no regularization of migrants. It is very closed. It is very closed. But the country, well, you know, Belgium is like 2 or maybe 3 countries in the interior of one. There's the like tiny German part, the Francophone part, and we work with the whole country. But situation of migrant women in the Flemish part is harder than in the Francophone part. Why? Because there are two different governments and the political situation are harder in the Flemish part. It's a little bit complicated here, but for example, there is a minister, a feminist minister, and there is more funding in the Francophone part, but in the Flemish part, no. So there is an imbalance here. And what we try and do is try and get together these two parts of the country and try to lobby for the sectors that are funding, be it the public sector or NGOs. So for us, the question of funding has to pass through being a big lobby, being visible, getting together, associating as an interest group, as a lobby also, and also with other feminist movements and also other mixed movements also. And also another strategy is that in every call, be it from the private or the public sector, or European even, they all speak about intersectionality. Intersectionality is a format now. It's a form that you have to fill in. How many foreign people are here, are this or that or whatever. And what we want to do is say that this intersectionality be applied to the reality. For example, a strategy is, why don't we do a positive action, for example? Let's fund every group of women, but there's women that need to be more funded. So we accompany them and we try and strengthen their capacities. But basically what we want is that this intersectionality be practical and take into account the reality, because if not, it's only a discourse. So this is important as a strategy, also as a social movement, as a feminist movement, and as a lobby.
Thoughts from the speakers about strategies. I would like to hear from you, Vanina, from the perspective of a women's fund. What do you think, what new funding and support models are needed from the EU and international communities to sustain migrant women activism?
Yeah, thanks, Paula. So let me start by saying that EU mechanisms are difficult to access even for European women's funds. Paperwork is just too much, accessibility criteria are very difficult to match. So of course, I can imagine for migrant women groups that tend to be unregistered, organized in more fluid ways and often smaller, it's pretty much impossible to access this kind of funding modalities. In 2020, Marrakesh collaborated with AWID and also as part of the Counting In consortium to issue a report exactly on this, so on funding modalities, which means how is money moving, basically, really highlighting what multi and bilateral funders can do to make sure that the money gets to feminist movements, including migrant women's rights groups. So what came out of that report is basically that the big money is usually the most difficult to access. It's not a surprise, I think, for anyone. But why is that? There are some blockages, some hurdles that bilaterals, particularly bilateral donors, are still putting in place. Some of them are, for instance, a lack of understanding of how feminist movements work. and how movements actors are present in the field. So how do they move? Another issue is about the understanding of social change. Someone before, and I apologize, I don't remember who, but there was this mention of constantly operating on a crisis mode, so that we go from crisis to crisis rather than really focusing on structural issues. And we do see that a lot also in bilateral and multilateral donors, so bigger donors, that rather than focusing on social change that takes decades of time, like it's not something that you do in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, there's this tendency of focusing on things that can take place immediately. Responding to a crisis is a big example of that, for instance. And there's also this tendency of going to funding what we know, what is known, so bigger INGOs that are maybe working with women migrants in Europe, but they are kind of addressing them as beneficiaries. So there is no funding going to self-led groups, to groups that are really composed of the constituencies that they are working with and for. So these are the big obstacles. There are ways, and there are also examples of multilateral donors that manage to go around this. And one big element is the political commitment. So one needs to be committed to migrant women's rights and really to understanding what it is that migrant women need, rather than being the funder deciding what is needed by them. The eligibility criteria are, as I was mentioning before, are very complicated. So like you have to be registered, you need to have 1, 2, 3 different kinds of audits every year, and that's costly and it's not covered. You need to have professional staff to take care of all the paperwork, but we are not going to pay for the salaries, right? So there are all these different elements that really complicate the access of migrant women to this funding. A solution could be having different tranches of funding, right? So you have smaller pots of money for smaller organizations, and then you have bigger amounts for other groups that are more professional. So you can, and when I say are more professional, I mean professional in the eyes of bigger organizations, right? With the governance in place that we're used to see. And also maybe being more open to regranting. And here is really the role of what women's funds can do is that we can take bigger amounts of money. We have audits in place, we have financial structure because we are organized in different ways, and then we are in a position of redistributing this money to smaller organizations that are not registered and that needs more flexibility in terms of how they are managing finances and salaries and all of these things. And then I would also say that there's the need of reviewing the funding programs. Again, giving core, flexible, multi-year funding, it's key. We cannot go around that. Political activism is work, it needs to be paid. We cannot think that activists can dedicate 24 hours of their time every day for 7 days a week without receiving salaries. So that's core funding. They need an office. Jennifer, you were mentioning your office space before. That's key. It provides space for people to meet. It provides space for people to strategize together. It's absolutely fundamental. Utilities, equipment, all things that need to be included in program funding. It needs to be accessible, so provide it in different languages, not only in English, not even only in French and Spanish. Like let's think bigger as much as possible, particularly working with migrant women's groups. And then we need to include movements in governance structure. So I won't say that every funder needs to be participatory. That would be nice, but I know that maybe it's difficult. But there are other structures, like there are advisory boards, expert boards. So there is the chance there if the commitment is present. I would say, just to close, it's really the need of understanding that activism doesn't work as an office. It's different. So you cannot think that activist groups operate as we would operate in a regular 9 to 5 kind of situation.
Thank you very much, Vanina. So thank you very much for all we have been hearing until now. We pretty much encourage you to ask questions, make comments, whatever you want to share on the chat. And we will go to a break now, a 10 minutes break. So yeah, we will be back in 10 minutes. So hi, welcome back. Hi. Hello. So I will continue now with the next question, which goes to Jennifer. Jennifer, if you could share with us, in your experience working with migrant women in Germany, how can funders best support migrant women organizations? And also, in what ways would your organization want to influence global funding dynamics? Oh, Jennifer is not here yet. Okay. Marcela, shall we start with you? Because actually I had the same questions for you. So shall I make the questions again?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. So the questions would be, how can funders best support migrant women organizations, in Belgium in your case? And in what ways would your organization want to influence global funding dynamics?
Yo pienso que
I think the first thing is to demand more coherence. For example, when we're speaking about politics in which donors are framed like gender mainstreaming, for example, supporting women and women's rights in particular, and even LGBTI people, there is not a lot of coherence because, for example, here in Belgium, I know it's great that there's a lot of funding for LGBTI plus people. There's a specific funding for gender mainstreaming, but in the topic, we can say if there's things to do with migrants, but there's not funding for small groups of migrant women, so it doesn't seem coherent. So the first thing for me would be asking for coherence, also for positive actions in funding, funding for organizations that I know that our organizations have to respond with reports, etc. It's obvious, but positive action with an accompaniment to these associations that respond to a certain characteristics would be important. And that is a way to support small migrant women associations, the way that it is done with LGBTI plus people, the same way. Also, the flexibilization of the requirements, which is the same logic. Under the same logic, we need to have a visible place, as Sophie was saying, but because if we don't have funding, it is, but also if we don't have funding, it is hard to be visible, because here we are not giving funding for operational needs, we're giving funding for activities. And if we don't change this perspective, it is going to be very difficult. I have been living here for years and years, and they repeat the same problem every time. We need a specific politics of politic actions to integrate these associations so that we improve the quality of funding and the fact that also that they are accompanied. It's not only money, we also need technical assistance. On the fourth question, how can we influence? Well, I think the first thing is to visibilize the situation inside the feminist movement and towards the public authorities and the donors also. Be it Europe, be it governments, being big NGOs. We need to be more visible. We need also to denounce our situation. everybody says it, everybody was speaking about after COVID, the importance of the work, that the essential work that migrant women do in this country. Yes, thank you very much. After COVID, everybody was saying, yes, great, thank you, but they haven't changed the status and they haven't changed anything, and we don't have access to funding, so what's up? And we, inside the feminist movement, we want our work to be acknowledged, the work of migrant women to be acknowledged. It's nothing new, but we want to still say it. And also European alliances, because there is a lot of funding that arrive to different countries for the same reasons. So there is a global dynamics of funding, and acknowledging that every country has their own obstacles for this problem, as they say, this problem of migration, as they name it, because they name us as a problem. We need funding for migrants, be it women, men, LGBTQ, and especially for women who have worked so hard for this during this process in the pandemic. Okay, I hadn't thought very much about this question, but this is what I can say.
What are some blocking points or concerns that funders have when it comes to supporting migrant women activism?
Thanks, Paula. I think some of my points will be repeating some of the points that my colleagues have already mentioned. So the question is about migrant women activism, and in activism I hear movement, and movements are often led, as we've discussed already a lot, by grassroots organizations that are not registered, not audited, don't have any financial documents that can be reviewed. I liked what Vanina said before about the fact that activism doesn't work like an office, which I think is absolutely true. And most foundations are not well placed, I would say, and we are not well placed to fund movements due to some internal rules. And I'm aware of some pioneer projects within certain foundations, in particular in the UK, to fund movements, but it is definitely not the norm. And I think that, as you pointed out, Vanina, before, there is definitely a role for Women's Fund to play in that respect. And we internally will actually have a discussion about that also next week, because we do identify some of these challenges and the discrepancy between the way we operate and what the sector needs. The second point I'd share is that there is a need somehow to embrace the complexity of social change and the ecosystems leading to change. And this may be in many cases incompatible with the provision of one single branch to a network that represents everyone and addresses all problems. So I would say that in my own experience, there is a tendency among funders to look for networks or seek to formalize networks instead of investing in ecosystem building or identifying who the players are as part of, first of all, identifying how the ecosystem works and who the actors are and their particular role as part of the ecosystem and how that contributes to change. So I think that this is much more difficult and this takes a lot of time compared to simply looking for a network that would do everything at the same time and represent everyone. The third point for me would be the need to explore possibilities to do grant making differently, coming back to some of the issues that were mentioned already earlier by almost all speakers. So having the possibility to provide longer-term funding to support the ambitions of migrant women movements, which are very often about systemic change. And here again, there is this discrepancy between that ambition, which doesn't have an end almost, and very short-term projects that are being supported. I think there is also a need to rethink systems of monitoring and evaluation, which is very present in the philanthropic sector, and instead to measure what matters to movement. So, and here I'm actually quoting a report, which I will post in the chat, so those are not my words. But it's a report that was recently published by two entities. So one is called Shake the Table, and the other one is the Bridgespan Group. And their report is called Lighting the Way, a report for philanthropy on the power and promise of feminist movements. And among actually 5 recommendations, the report mentions the need to measure what matters to movements. So they say the multifaceted work of movements will likely require a range of measures, work with grantees to define success and allow them to pivot as needed. And I think that's really what's, I mean, I found this recommendation extremely valuable and also echoes some of my experience in the sector. And we've already mentioned core funding to allow for flexibility, but also to address the factors that may enable or hinder activism. So I'm here referring to costs, for instance, related to childcare, or costs related to unpaid leave, for instance, for people to be able to actually be part of these movements, which is often not a given. And as a final point, I would say that there is definitely a need for awareness raising among funders. So there is a need to be almost pedagogical and convince funders, or this can also work through self-learning, of course, but I do think that there is still a lot of convincing to do about the need to support women activism as part of the migration and human rights civil society ecosystems. Those are systems that are already, I would say, very crowded and where funding is scarce. So I think there is a need to raise awareness around what's the particular role of women activists in that space, what are the changes that women activists aim to achieve in that space, what's the specific vision that's being promoted. I would in no way assume that everyone already understands. And I think there is definitely space to build a compelling narrative that people can easily repeat to convince their colleagues and leadership, also speaking about myself, to actually show why women activism and migrant women activism specifically is needed to achieve social change.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you also for this last point about the importance of make people aware of about the importance of women's activism. So my next question goes to Jennifer. Jennifer, if you can share with us your experience in Germany specifically, how can funders best support migrant women's organizations, and in what ways would your organization want to influence global funding dynamics?
Thank you very much, Paola, for the question. Again, it's just adding to what every panelist is mentioning. But first, before I say how funding can be, how funders can support the work of migrant women, it's very important to point out that the work that we are very actively doing, it's mostly the rights of migrant women, a certain group of precarized people. and in this case, women. And we have to acknowledge as a society, especially now us coming here from our own countries, and the racism and every ism we are confronted with, is failure by the state, usually to provide the basic living standards for a certain community, for a certain group of people. And if that can be incorporated, because we are doing a lot of work in terms of advocacy, and if you see any migrant group that is being recognized, the amount of work they have put in terms of advocacy is so much, just for the small recognition that they receive. If this work of activism, of advocacy is contextualized in a way that it has to be imposed to the civic society, in a form of implementation, I don't know how. That way we will yield an effect of the work that we are continuously doing. Because if you look at the work that we are doing, usually, I'm talking about now human rights, it's the same. For example, now we have students fleeing from Ukraine, everybody's fleeing from Ukraine, and it's an emergency situation. And in this emergency response situation, then of course the racism comes out again, that certain communities, people of color, are not put together with every other Ukraine that was fleeing war. And the racism that the BIPOC community fleeing war should not flee because for whatever reasons. And the racism we have seen them being racial profiled in the trains and being picked out, then comes to an emergency response system. And this emergency response system, so people are put in the situation of looking for money to fix a situation that the state should actually fix, is something that that needs to be, I don't know how it needs to be incorporated in, again, what I was trying to say. So if co-funding was increased, I'm talking of co-funding because that's how then we are able to dignify our livelihood here. With this, we are able to be able to not to do another extra job in order to pay for our basic human, basic survival things, that is in terms of rents, health insurance, retirement insurance. Then in the other time that we remain, we have to focus on the activism that we have to do so that we can create the awareness. That calls for acknowledgement of the work of the women that is being done. And this acknowledgement should be equivalent to, more funding to be able to dignify the lives of people who are doing this work. The other thing that would be important to mention, how funders can support the work that we do, is to give more funding for training and courses, because then you come to a country which does not even recognize your certificates that you studied in your own country. So of course, you're out of the job market for the credentials that you have from whichever country that you come from. Then the system puts you in a state where you only fit for certain jobs. I had Marcela talk towards that direction, to the care work or to the hotel industry or to cleaning. And if funding would enable more training courses, then we would be able to support women who are interested in being relevant to the job market, because it's not that we don't have the knowledge when you're coming from our countries, but it's just because of racism that the credentials that we come with are not recognized, and they do not want to recognize them for the reasons that we already speaking about. So if more funding would enable also, there would be more funding in training and courses, that would be something that would be very, very, very useful for ensuring a continuation of better conditions for women. And I think we are doing a lot to influence the society. And this influence, of course, is with the little help that we are getting. But I would imagine that what Sophie is saying, that grantees and people who are giving funding should find a way of working together. There should be a bridge in between these two groups, so that we can come up with very effective ways of changing the society, because actually we are trying to change a society to make it more habitable for certain communities. That's all I need to add.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So my next question goes to Vanina. Vanina, if you can share in your experience, how can migrant women organizations influence the global funding dynamics and decision-making processes?
Yeah, thanks, Paula. So I think the easy answer to this difficult question is for migrant women's groups to work more with allies, including women's funds, to have access to the spaces in which decisions on global funding are made. There's the possibility also of using social media, online campaigns. I'm mentioning this specifically because it's relatively less expensive in terms of implementation than other types of campaigns can be. That said, so this is my easy answer. Like, my real answer to the question is that I would like to change the question and ask, what can people in the position, in global funding decision-making positions, do to guarantee the access of migrant women into those spaces? Because both things that I mentioned before require a lot of work from migrant women. We just discussed very much about the fact that this work is usually not paid. It takes time and it distracts also from the actual purpose of the activism that migrant women are intending to do. So we know that migrant women's voices are underrepresented in Europe. There's an intersection of discrimination based on gender within the migrant movement itself because of being women. Often women are not seen as political actors in many spaces. And there's also the element of racism, clearly. So I think that global decision makers should really step out of this white savior kind of approach that sees migrant women as beneficiaries rather than actors. So that's the starting point. I mentioned before the idea of participatory grant making. Again, I do recognize that this is really probably the last step in a very long process of change and opening up to the needs and positions and voices of those that are really experiencing the situation that we want to challenge. So we don't really need to get to that more extreme kind of scenario, although it's probably the most ideal one. But again, just recognizing that migrant women are those that have the experience. So we need to just recognize them for the experts that they are, invite them rather than having them knocking at our doors very often unsuccessfully. That's frustrating and it's disrespectful, and it's also very, like, just plainly often racist. So just change the point of view and being us inviting migrant women into spaces. Again, one role of, I think, everyone here in the room is that we can be the facilitators of this process. And we can really work towards changing the attitude and views of those in position of power and having the bigger amounts of money to make sure that this change happens. And don't get me wrong, I think that the intentions are good. Like, I mean, there's been a lot more money that is intended for women's rights. There's a lot of talking about migrations. There starts to be some understanding about gender issues in relation to migration, I think. It's not as developed as it could be, but it's starting to be there. but there's still this really the mentality of not seeing migrant women as the protagonists of their own stories and of their own narratives and of their solutions that can be implemented. And on top of that, there's also a lot of things that we don't want to change or that governments don't want to change in their structures, right? So it's difficult, it's complicated, but there are ways in which the doors can be open and should be open. So I really hope that we can all work together to find ways to open them for migrant women to be able to be at the right tables.
Thank you very much, Vanina. So this was the last of the questions I had prepared. We would like now to open the floor to the audience. We will make you visible, if that is okay for everyone. And we also would like to invite you to the audience if you want to make a comment, to make a question to one of our speakers, to share an experience. If you are in another territory and want to share what your experience there is working as or with migrant women activism, you are pretty much welcome. Is it possible to make the audience visible? Hidayah?
Yes, I can make anyone visible if they wish to be visible while they're asking the question, so they can indicate in the chat. You can indicate in the chat if you like to be your video or your camera to be turned on. I can do that.
Okay, so I will start with some of the questions we had already on the chat. This is a question for all of the speakers. You can respond if you want. The question is, the funding support seems so limited, increasing a high level of competition. What can we do to build solidarity among groups and increase the cake, so to speak? This is a question actually that Marcela already talked about a little bit. I don't know if the other speakers want to share something on this topic.
I will just give my thoughts on this question, because it's important that we have a good understanding of the political work that we are doing, because I've also seen, for example, us being questioned with a group of refugee women that is also working in another state, why we cannot combine this group and be one big group instead of being many groups. And this now brings the thought why we cannot have as many groups as possible for everybody who is willing to bring a front. And with this understanding, when people have a political understanding that also through this funding, there comes some form of divisions or divide and conquer kind of way, because they will fund this and they will not fund this. So these people are more visible than these people. And when we have that understanding, then it is important then to also have a very broad critical reference, not a reference, feedback to the people funding, because then we project what they are trying to do in terms of making this campaign more important and not this one. I will give an example with this now. Everything is about climate change and global warming. And we know who has been spoiling. We are indigenous people and we live with the nature. We are in harmony with the nature. Now there's this big campaign to try and do damage control to the environment that has been damaged by a certain group of people. But they do not want to acknowledge the people being affected by these climate changes and how they approach or they would want the change to be. It's again, the hierarchy also still comes in this kind of topics. And then you see the money that is put into these campaigns. The money that is invested in these campaigns also is money that you don't, I have no ones to use, but then again, resources are used and are available for certain groups and for very particular campaigns, but not for other equally or more important campaigns. So we should be very aware of this, these divisions that availability of money creates within people fighting for the same cause.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think Marta has a question.
Yes, thank you. Well, actually, it's not a question, it's a reflection. I would like to thank you. I think it's very interesting as I see like a process of beginning, because whenever when you have a lot of food for thought, usually the questions come after. When we finish, then we say, why didn't I say that? Why didn't I comment that? So perhaps a lot of things will come from that. But my imagination, creativity comes to a lot of things. One of them is like a challenge ourselves inside our movement, inside our organization, and the outside to decolonize language. Because I think if for both funders, for us writing some kind of, application of whatever, it's like offended. We are working in the 75 or 50 years. Problem 3, I don't like to address things as problems. I would like to address things like what can we do as agents? And they say, why don't you speak in the name of women? I cannot speak in the name of any woman. I can speak for frontliners women. I can share stories from people doing art, activism, trying to find new questioners ourselves, and find reflection and time that finish, and how many people attended, and one project, and how many results. So as I see this like as a process, and I would like to have, for example, a festival of funders where you share these wonderful ideas, because I live in Denmark, by the way, I live in Denmark. And many new feminists are coming and say, oh, it's the same, do you have problems, solutions? I say, oh my God, no, are we going for the same thing? So, but very much like to share this with those donors, which are, they are not feminists, and the organization, they are not, we have, how they call it, gender focus point, and they say our general secretary doesn't know even what it is. So do we have to begin from, I mean, and be like, how did you say? Some of you say that we have to be mediators, and it's like we are not advancing. So thank you very much. I see this as a beginning. I would like to have a festival of donors with a feminist perspective. I would like to see decolonizing language everywhere, finding new words. As I say, we are not, my colleagues from Spain, we are not victimized, we are not, but it's on top of things, we have been like migrant women sometimes, and other groups are like re-victimized, like, oh, poor people are seen as beneficiaries. I would like to speak towards frontliners. We want to change everywhere, in every movement. So that was my reflection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. We have Marie Lucia, who has raised her hand. Hey, Lucia, can you? I don't see you here. There. If you can turn on your mic, I can do it for you. Marie?
Hola.
Hola. You can speak now.
Hola.
Yes, we can hear you.
¿Se me oye?
Sí.
Ah, vale. Bueno, voy a hablar en castellano. No sé si igual en francés o bueno, en inglés todavía.
En castellano sin problema, sin problema.
Vale. Pues bueno, primero quería agradecer, no se me ve, pero bueno, no pasa nada, agradecer la invitación. Yo soy...
I want to thank for the invitation. My name is Mari Lucia. I live in Spain. In Bilbao, I come from the Democratic Republic of Congo, even if there's no democracy there. And as a migrant, I am here. I received this through Galala, through the email of the association, and I coordinate a women's organization for Congo women. We have just started in 2019, and I share very much what all the panelists have said. But I see there are many points. I see there are many points that we also live here, that we share here. It is very hard to have access to grants, to conventional grants. For example, we are starting to enter in the spaces of funds, and as you were saying, here, the new ones, the ones that are not known, in order to access funds, it's hard for us. All the logistics it implies, and also because they are not known. And also in many spaces, as Jennifer was saying before, and I think Marcela was also saying, there are also the spaces that I loved what Marcela was saying about intersectionality, because it's exactly what we live in the association. In order to fill in a form, I have to fill in all of these things, but in the practice, we don't live it. And I have a question about strategies, concrete strategies of how you have built these alliances, not only for funds, but also to maintain your own lines of work, to be able to maintain your own lines of work, be there a donation or not. We don't have donations. We have common money that we have, like a grassroots money that we have. Because migrant African women, we have to struggle, we have to fight. There's this resilience, but you were speaking about visibilizing, but sometimes it seems that we have to demonstrate constantly that we are capable of doing things, and this is tiring. I like this idea of the donor festival, but there was also a call, I don't know if it exists or not, of this encounters, these meetings of organizations of women in which we could get together, because we work with alliances and synergies and with other women. This is what is our strength. This Saturday, for example, we're going to have a table with different journalists. And here in Spain, in the Basque Country, everything is for Ukraine. It seems that nothing else exists at the moment. So I wanted to ask, what are the concrete strategies that we can transmit to others, for example, to us, concrete strategies, and also if there are encounters, if there are meetings that you know, in order to create these networks between and synergies between different organizations of women. And thank you so much for this meeting also.
Translators. I would like to offer to the speakers the floor if they want to comment or react to what Marta and Maria Lucia shared.
I'm happy to start, Paula, sharing a few points in terms of strategies. I see, I'm not sure it will fully answer your question, Maria Lucia, but it can be potentially a start. I think there is a real opportunity to build allyship with members of staff from certain foundations. I mean, there are a few of us on the call now. Personally in a position, I would say, of like mid leadership. So I'm not leading my organization. And I don't know, about Vanina, for instance, but I think there is a real opportunity to create this sort of allyship so that certain members of staff also speak internally to their colleagues in order to raise awareness and about some of the points that have been shared in our space today, for instance. I think there is also a responsibility for us, and I see that as a responsibility for me and for the organization I work for, to create spaces where we are able to invite migrant women activists to join. So for instance, one space that I've been thinking of, which is quite a new space within our collaborative, is a space we've been creating on racism and migration, which is strangely very new because as a collaborative, we are not used to speaking about the very obvious overlap between racism and migration policies and practices. But that's a space where I can, it's a space I think of where I would see opportunities to bring on board migrant women activists to join the conversation. So those are just two ideas, but yeah, I'm happy to come in later after other colleagues have the opportunity to contribute as well.
Thank you, Sophie. Vanina, Marcela, Jennifer, do you want to react, make a comment? Marcela.
Sí, lo que...
Yes, I think it's really important. Well, at least in my experience and of other colleagues here, is that in order to have access to funds, you need a previous work which you have to interpel somehow to raise awareness about migrant women, because if they don't know that migrant women are important, they don't take they don't take account of you as an actor. We have done all this work inside the feminist movement in Belgium, which is very open, but there's a lot of diversity. And we need to create solidarity here, so in order to get access to resources. There's this question of a transmission of not only between generations of women, activists, feminists, but also a horizontal transmission between different groups, different organizations. And maybe this is something that is necessary, and it's not and we don't work on it so much because there's so many perspectives, needs of each group. And I think this is a challenge, but it is an important one in this building of a feminist solidarity that is deep, that is a deep solidarity that is profound. I don't think there is so much competition here on resources. What there is this a lack of access. We don't even have access. So we don't even compete because we don't even have access. So what we need is to facilitate this access between each other. It is important to be autocritical, to have, also when we speak about intersectionality, we have to think of this more seriously. It is not because this migrant comes here and it's just like a decoration of intersectionality. We have to take this seriously. We have to try and speak with governments, because if we don't perceived as strong by the government, they won't take us in account. Also, between us, between migrant women, there are some that have more experience. There are some that do this type of work, this other type of work. And sometimes we repeat this system of domination. So we have to be very careful. I work with colleagues that have other experiences, that have other capacities. Some know how to do these projects. So this transmission is also important, because if not, we repeat the same domination system. So this solidarity, this feminist solidarity, has to completely impregnate all these groups, these feminist groups. This is a challenge also. And another one, the fact that we have access to funds is no favor. Nobody has to do us a favor and give us this little bit, so that we want big funds, not small things that are supported on free work. So we have to have this clear, and we have to say this clearly to feminists and to mixed groups and to politicians. This is important in order to have access to funds. Thank you.
I think Marcela has said a lot, because it's very collective, and I can imagine where if the group is just beginning, the challenges it is having in terms of even making their work visible. I would just give a few tips from where we started 10 years ago when we were an unregistered organization. Is that what we did? We were very consistent. It's very tiring, but we were very consistent and adamant in terms of positioning ourselves in a very wide space, which spoke of feminism that did not represent us. And this consistency, I can say now, we can see it bears fruit, but it's a lot of work. So if the person asking would also consider trying to work with organizations who are very reflective, so that then we don't reproduce the same forms of abuse that have been imposed on us, would also be helpful, because I have seen over the years now, migrant groups are beginning to form a front as a block, which has been very helpful. And I would give an example with White Plus, with what it is doing, that we have done now a mapping in the whole of Europe, and we can represent a block of women, a block of migrant women, to represent ourselves. So this is also another example that is very important, that and to acknowledge the works of groups like White Plus and other people who are putting clusters on different parts of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. If there are no other questions, I would go back to two questions we still had on the chat. The first one, it is from Gea, and she's asking, Sophie mentioned before the strategy to be more at the field, as a strategy for foundations to better understand and connect to grassroots level. Would you recommend this as a main strategy to help foundations to better respond to the needs at the grassroots level? Would you focus this at the trustee level as well? Should we promote to have more migrant women in the funding institutions? Who wants to react on this?
I can get us started. I think I talked about this already a little bit in my previous interventions, but I do think that it's absolutely necessary to have more migrant women in decision-making spaces, including in funding spaces. When we talk about political participation, I feel of migrant women, women in general, I feel that often we focus on the typical political spaces, like parliament, government, but where is the money moving? Where is the decision on money being made? Often it happens in other spaces, and that can be private foundations as well as bilateral foundations. So I think that it's very important for migrant women, as I was saying before, rather than them coming and knocking at doors, like being able to reach those doors without having to beg for it, because that's really not what it should be about. So it should really be a work of sensitizing everyone about the importance of having their voices directly in the places where decisions are made.
Thank you, Vanina. Okay, so I will go now with the last questions we have, with the last question we have on the chat. It's also an open question, so yeah, the speaker who wants can respond. The question is, what political hurdles do you face in particular in promoting, supporting migrant women and LGBTQI communities in the funding structure, such as racism against refugees, wanting to apply a bureaucratic approach that forgets the power imbalances, or not understanding the particular intersections between gender and migration issues? What political hurdles do you face?
Maybe I could respond to that because it kind of touches on the work that you're doing. I think the biggest political hurdle we have faced is that women are not seen as political. Migrating is not seen as a political statement. People expect a man can do whatever it is and it is political, but we are not looked as political people. And the fact that we have dared to cross borders and we are here, and these borders, we have crossed them in ways that the state has put so much hindrances, different states, and we have managed to cross borders is something people should always acknowledge as a political statement. We have refused to stay in places that we are not feeling happy. We have decided to make it a political decision to shift. This is one of the challenges, and this mentality that women are not political is something that this narrative should be changed. What is personal is political. If you've decided to migrate, that's already a political statement. And then we are confronted with the racism. Racism is such a big topic. I don't even want to touch on it, but I'm going to talk about the racist structures that the state still does not want to change. And this, I'm more commonly talking about now the bureaucratic aspect of it, whereby you come to a country, in the beginning, they don't allow you to learn the language. And when you're allowed to learn the language, it's limited. But every letter you get from the migration office comes in the highest level of German. If you're in the asylum process, then comes a letter in the highest level of law, the law language, and yet the basic level of understanding, even learning the language, is not possible. And the kind of the integration course that we are allowed to have is only, in our understanding, it should only be enough to hear and take instructions, but not to be part of a discussion. And this is something that needs to be addressed. And this is what we are working on, that we are insisting, we are in these countries, we are not asking for inclusions, for example, even if it's in the language, that they include talking in our mother tongue. We are demanding the inclusion of all the colonial languages, because all of them speak these colonial languages. But when it comes to certain aspects, then only their language matters. And these are some of the hurdles that we experience. Also, as a women's group, when we come to formulating political demands for women, and women who come along with their children, it's always very hard to separate these issues of a child and a mother. When it's a mother, it's always the mother, but it's always the child, and the needs of the mother always come last. So we are really trying to also make these differences, because it doesn't mean once you're a mother, you don't have your own needs as a woman. And these are challenges that are things we are trying to focus on now.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Marcela.
Sí, aquí, por ejemplo, en Bélgica, digamos que el principal problema es...
Problem is, I already said it, but the national politics, the federal politics, it's clearly anti-migration. Very clearly, it's aligned with the Frontex politics in Europe, and so we are in a difficult place. They have all this political performance also with the refugees. But in the case of women, of refugee women, of candidates, this notion of victims, the terrible things that happen, this is clear, but this idea of depoliticization of women, this regard towards women. Women are victims that are used, for example, now with the war, with the terrible war in Ukraine, which is terrible. But these migrant women are also victims, but they're helped here. But migrant women that come from other horrors, from other third countries, as they say, they are less important. And this makes it so clear of the racist perspective of politics. This happens in the whole of Europe, but this shocked us. And if we are continued being seen as victims, if they're continued seen as victims, it seems that they are helped, but they are invisibilized and be it students, refugees, whichever undocumented women that arrived here, they are invisibilized and they seem that they're all under the same pack. And this is a problem. And also with feminist comrades, for example, in the Flemish part, migrants, good migrants, let's say, are well seen, and we can't speak about the other ones, the ones that are a burden for the state. So I would be a good migrant because I work. The other ones that are more invisible are the bad migrants. They are the examples of the ones that had to be sent to their countries. So this is a perspective that there's here, and it is very hard for women there, because this this range of they use it to invisibilize what migrant women bring. And so we have to shout, we have to be visible, we have to be taken into account.
This session, I want to thank everyone a lot for all what you have shared. It has been really interesting for me, as coming from a women's fund in Spain. It is always tremendously interesting to have these kinds of spaces for exchange, listening to you, and continue learning for doing our job. I would like to ask the speakers if you have any closing comments before we close. If not, I would like to pass the floor to Hidaya from White Plus, so she can wrap up the session.
Yes, so thank you so much. On behalf of White Plus and our Migration and Gender Working Group, we would like to thank all the speakers, Jennifer, Marcela, Sophie, and Vanina, for your constructive interventions. And of course to Paula for moderating this much needed dialogue, and the translators also for providing this simultaneous translations, and also for the hard work of the artist, Marga, who tried very hard, but somehow, you know, the technical gods or goddesses are not on our side today for the illustration. Indeed, just to summarize, you know, the dialogue, migrant women are powerful agents of transformative change, and much more can be done to ensure the sustainability of their work in our societies, and also the important roles of foundations and donors as partners in supporting, enhancing, and continuing this work that migrant women organizations do as well. Thank you so much for the audience, for your attendance and for your engagement in this dialogue. We look forward to sharing the recording of this dialogue session with you in a couple of days, or at least by next week. We will share it with you via email. There will be recordings in English and also in Spanish. In the meantime, you can also download the paper regarding marginalizing migrant women in EU policies, tracking EU funds, that's already live on White Plus website. The beautiful illustrations for Marga will also be shared, and that can be used for advocacy, some key takeaways from today's discussions. For now, I wish everyone, you know, a good rest of the day, and we'll see you soon at our next event, perhaps the Festival of Funders, Festival of Donors, Festival of Migrant Women. We don't know. We shall see. I'll see you soon then. Thank you so much. See you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Bye.
Gracias.
Bye. Thank you.
Chao, chao.